Hello, welcome to today's lecture, which is about rights and values and conflict.
Now it's my rights versus yours. Under your wheels, your hopeless rain. You fall too hard, we're up too late. We had suspended from the heights until it's safer to walk here. Under your wheels, your chances with the easy call, the call I've searched, the medicine, it still won't work, but there's dangerous levels of it here. Same thing as the other time, but now it's your rights versus mine. The truth.
Today we're going to look at clashing rights and values, mainly within democracies. Of course, we have seen that identity conflict is a major trend in states of all regime types, but rights coming into conflict requires citizens to have rights in the first place, so this is mainly a topic for study in democracy. Indeed, these issues come out of some fundamental contradictions in democracy. Democracy is meant to preserve its citizens' rights, but sometimes these rights conflict. Another way to think of that is that where democracy is people governing themselves, often the people are divided into groups that just don't seem to see eye to eye. So we're talking a lot about the issues so common in today's headlines here in the United States, the things that get labeled as culture wars. These involve fundamental differences in views about what the state should be and basic differences in deeply held values. For instance, these are trade-offs of equality and liberty, individual rights and group rights, the tension between encouraging diversity and fostering a national identity, or the contrast between those who value the order of the community and those who would rather place the emphasis on individual expression. As we have seen before, there are rarely objective rights and wrongs in these debates. Instead, the answer for an individual, community, or state may often depend on the aspects of democracy that are more valued, or even more fundamentally, what it means to this individual or society to lead a good life. So let's start by thinking about rights and conflict. The first step here is to think briefly about what rights are. Well, this is another one of those tricky terms that we all think we have an understanding of, but that's actually quite tricky to define, let alone measure in a scientific manner. Rights are those things to which every citizen has a claim, something each person is entitled to. This is the basic idea behind life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But beyond those very basic rights, this doesn't really give us a good sense of how we know rights when we see one, and how we can tell them from privileges. One take on rights are that they are what we all have by birth. This is the idea of unalienable rights, and it is one useful way to look at the issue. Still, it's not really right to say that people are born with rights. Obviously, we aren't born with something guaranteeing that we'll be able to vote. And of course, theorists have proposed all kinds of rights. There are negative rights guaranteeing our right to not have to do something, and positive rights guaranteeing our right to be able to do something. There are natural rights endowed to us by our maker, and legal rights agreed upon as groups in order to construct society. Then, of course, there are T.H. Marshall's famous classification of political, social, and civil rights. And from there it just gets more and more complicated, and the term has been added to the end of nearly every phrase for usage by all sorts of groups, from gun rights to labor rights to patient rights to consumer rights to animal rights. It might be hard to agree when rights are really rights, but I think that one thing we can agree upon is this: rights are relative or dependent on the individual. Thus, they are both subjective and normative. Subjective here is the opposite of objective, and means to depend on perspective and opinion. Normative goes back to what we discussed at the beginning of the course, and is the opposite of empirical. Normative means to have to do with evaluations of morality or the way things should be, whereas empirical means just talking about the world as it is, just the data. So rights are not objective facts that we can search for empirically. Instead, they are essentially judgments. That rights are relative helps to account for the fact that they so often come into conflict. Individuals value very different rights, meaning that there may well be rights that I hold dear that you do not, and vice versa. If we were engaged in a debate with one another and had a difference of opinion about a political policy, such as affirmative action, abortion, or LGBT rights, we might actually just deny each other's concepts of rights. So when I point to one right, you might say that's not valid, and I might do the same to you. One reason that rights differ so much from person to person is that our personal value structures also differ. Values are our ideals about what a good, just life is. Theorists and scientists have offered many different lists of values, but things like individual liberty, fairness and equality, and deference to authority and social order are very common. These values are parts of our personality. Indeed, a lot of good research shows how much values differ from person to person. Moreover, some psychologists and social scientists have shown that those of different ideological leanings have different value structures. As our values help determine our outlook on rights, this helps to account for why people of different ideological belief systems often don't seem the same rights as important. It's not just that the liberals and conservatives or lefts and rights don't agree on a given policy position for pragmatic purposes. It goes deeper than that. It might actually be because they value different rights, because they have different value structures under their political opinions. So attitudes about rights also differ cross-culturally. One way we see this is by comparing states' constitutions. In the United States, we have a relatively ancient democratic constitution that includes a pretty limited concept of rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as well as some basic legal rights, but stopping at a pretty minimal position comparatively. However, popular rights have grown a good deal, and most newer constitutions have more guaranteed rights included. For example, the South African Constitution from 1996 includes a very long list of rights that has things that would be very strange to see as rights for most Americans, including rights to equality, housing, and even healthcare. The fact that these rights are dependent upon subjective factors like value structures and cultural norms, taken with the problem that rights are nearly impossible to define, well, that's what makes it so difficult to determine who is correct when these rights come into conflict. People may not even acknowledge the rights of others as legitimate, like their own rights. So things get pretty complicated with individual rights, but they get even more complicated when it comes to group rights. The idea behind group rights is that a distinct group is more than the sum of the individuals comprising it. Therefore, groups also need provisions that promote their rights and liberties. The idea here is that legal rights for individuals might not be enough to protect those individuals and marginalized groups from discrimination or the degradation of their culture. To help such groups, many societies provide all members in a given group with status or privileges that help them to counter the marginalization, discrimination, and/or inequality they face, or perhaps that they've faced over a long period of history. One form of group rights is simply allowing groups a bit of extra independence within the state, which is used particularly when a distinct culture is at risk of being swallowed up by the majority culture. One example of this is Catalonia in Spain, which is where Barcelona is located. Catalonia is a region with its own distinct language, culture, and history, and they have therefore fought for and won a degree of independence and self-governing ability within the broader Spanish state. Another example is the way that Native Americans in the United States are typically given some form of limited sovereignty over their own lands. Obviously, group rights can be extended in quite controversial ways. When a society involves great inequities that run along some group cleavage, whether this is by race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or class, many will often deem it prudent to allow these groups extra rights or opportunities in an attempt to level the playing field and help to reduce the inequality. However, these policies, often called affirmative action, can attract great criticism. One closely related concept here is the idea of descriptive representation. This is akin to the idea that to be truly represented by your government, people like you need to have some say in the policymaking process. People like you need to have access to power. And by people like you, I mean people with the same group memberships and the same life experiences as you. This can be based on ethnicity, race, religion, gender, or any cleavage really. And it's probably the idea that Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor was getting at when she infamously commented that a wise Latina woman brings perspective to the court that a white man without the experiences of a Latina woman couldn't really bring. The central point here is that people in power should be like the people they govern, so that they understand the needs of those they are meant to represent. So let's think through an example of this in the form of quota systems. We know that a common democratic value is representation of the people within a state. Women are a bit over half of the population in most states, and yet they tend to not be very well represented in political office. So here is a chart from The Economist that shows the percentage of women in the legislature of various countries. Indeed, though they are half of the population in every country, they are only over half of the legislature in one country, Rwanda. The world average is more like 20% of women in the legislature. If you think that there is any logic to the idea of descriptive representation, this should concern you, as it means that a very large group, women, generally have policymakers working above them that may not understand their perspective. And finally, the places with the most equitable division of seats in the legislature tend to be the places that have quotas of some sort. Now, these quotas might be baked into the Constitution in the form of formal rules requiring a certain percentage of women in the legislature, or it may be done on a voluntary basis by political parties who can ensure that a certain percentage of all of their candidates are female, and this is a pretty common practice in Western Europe. Another pertinent example of quota systems is in India, where quotas have been used very widely, especially to overcome India's caste system. Indian society has long been divided into different castes, or social groups that are said by Hindu religious texts to have their own place in society, whether that be at the top or at the very bottom, as in the case of the so-called untouchables. Obviously, the idea that a person can be born as inferior to another and has no path out of that inferior social standing is really not part of our contemporary democratic ideal. So India utilizes a very comprehensive quota system for representation in Indian universities, the civil service, so government jobs, and even in the parliament. This quota system involves reserving seats and positions for those groups who have been discriminated against in order to help them out of positions of intense poverty and discrimination. It has made a large impact, though it is of course highly controversial. For instance, if you are applying to an Indian university and you are not part of one of the groups that get reserved seats, you are competing with way more than half of the population of India, those people like you who are not members of these groups, but you're competing for about half of the seats in the university that are left over after the reservations. It is important to note, however, that rules like these quotas in India are important beyond democratic ideals and descriptive representation. These institutions can also have great effects on the stability of the state, as when large marginalized groups feel permanently left out of the political decisions affecting their lives, they are much more likely to resort to violence, extremism, and all sorts of things that are pretty harmful to political systems. Thus, systems designed to provide group rights can have a very practical function alongside their idyllic moral imperative. As I mentioned earlier, the notion of group rights and the policies enacted to increase them are often very controversial. Now, proponents of group rights argue that they are essential to helping groups overcome enormous inequality and discrimination that certain groups have had to deal with for generations. Also, they are good for helping to preserve cultures that are at risk of being lost by assimilation into a dominant culture, as we saw with the case of Catalonia in Spain and the Native Americans in the United States. Finally, group rights can be tools to work towards certain ideals of democratic representation, especially notions of descriptive representation and fairness, and helping to sort of pay back groups who have endured historical discrimination and other really terrible things like systemized violence perpetuated against them, or slavery, or being completely shut out of the social and economic systems of the state. So those are some arguments for. Now, critics of group rights argue that in creating these special classes of rights, the state is essentially choosing winners and losers and getting a lot more involved than it needs to, essentially overriding the limited government that is important to democracy. Moreover, critics of these policies argue that they can create inequality for those outside of the group. They argue that these group rights do not help society work towards the democratic ideal, but that instead they undermine that ideal by eroding equal treatment by the law and infringing upon personal liberties. This is a great illustration of how perfectly valid rights can conflict. On the one hand, people seem to have some sort of right to an equal shot at a good life and success and political representation. This often seems to require some sort of institutionalized quota system or legal action, as we saw with quotas for women and underprivileged castes. Still, in doing this, the state may detract from the individual liberty that is the heart of liberal democracy. Debates in democratic theory and our current political dialogue often come down to this tension between the rights of equality and liberty. And finally, on a more practical note, policies that encourage group independence or special attention may help reinforce the boundaries that cause the problems among groups in the first place. Okay, well that's a very brief primer on the issue of clashing rights. I hope that this has given you a bit to think about in light of the current political debates. If not, get in touch and let me know.
But now it's your rights versus mine. The truth in one free afternoon. The truth in one free afternoon. Under my wheels, the chances have